Good evening, and wow, I have to make sure I don't get into that zone. I'm sorry, the previous two speakers have both mentioned urination. There will be no urination in my talk. But I'm actually going to harken back to something that Anusha Yadav spoke about. And my talk will include a lot of old pictures, so I hope that you can see them properly there, and some music. I've been fascinated by this story because it's a story that takes place about 80 years ago. So you're going to have to use your imagination and your sense of history to take this journey with me. But it's a story about Bombay and about India's ability to completely soak in all sorts of completely diverse influences and make them entirely its own. And so let's start off by giving you an example of what I'm talking about. This is a clip from a film called Albela. It was one of the biggest hits in 1951. How many of you all are into old Hindi film songs? All right, that's quite a lot of people. And so, has anybody seen this film, Albela? It's a story of a poor man who's played by that guy whose name is Bhagwan. He was mostly a comedian, but in this film he was the hero, and he managed to become the hero because he was the producer of the film, so he gave himself the job. And he dreams of making it big on the theater stage. And so we're going to watch one of the songs, which is called Divana Parwana. And I want you to watch it, but mainly I want you to listen closely and watch closely to the guy who appears at the end, the guy who's playing the trumpet. So that guy, the man playing the trumpet, he went by the name of Chick Chocolate. I'm not sure quite how he got his name. His real name was Antonio Xavier Vaz, but he decided that Chick Chocolate was a good name for a trumpet player. And he was one of Bombay's most famous band leaders. Albela became so popular that when he did his stage shows, he decided to adopt those funny frilly dresses that they're actually used in the film. In the 1940s and the 1950s, Chick Chocolate was playing everywhere. As this ad shows, he was playing at the Taj Mahal in Colaba. This is a picture that was shot at the National Sports Club, which is now called the Vallabhbhai Patel Stadium in Worli, just by Haji Ali. And as this clip shows, he was considered one of the finest dance bands in all of India. Chick Chocolate, in addition to playing the trumpet, also sang in a gravelly voice. Very much like, how many of you all have heard of a guy called Louis Armstrong? He sang a very famous song called What a Wonderful World. And so Louis Armstrong was one of the most famous musicians in the world in the 1940s and the 1950s. And so Chick Chocolate was called the Louis Armstrong of India. And so he played and he sang like Louis Armstrong, and he also tried to look like Louis Armstrong. And as you see here, he actually looks like this man who was his hero from New Orleans. So the appearance of Chick Chocolate in Albela was a little unusual. These musicians who performed in the studios weren't seen very often on screen. But the kind of music that we heard in that clip with trumpet solos and crashing cymbals and all of this, this was the music that many of you all will know as jazz. And so we're going to figure out how jazz actually got to Bollywood. This is probably one of the most famous examples of jazz in Bollywood, and you probably know it. And again, you're going to have to show me how to play it. Ah, no. Just click here. All right.
Ina mina dika, dai damenika, maka naga naga, dika bika dika. Ina mina dika dika de dai damenika, maka naga dika bika rola dika, ram pam poch, ram pam poch.
So many of you know that song, and that is a very jazzy song. So how did jazz come to find its way into Bollywood? For that, we're going to have to travel back in time. It's 1935, and this is the ballroom of the Taj Mahal Hotel in Colaba. And on stage is this guy in the front. His name is Leon Abbey, and he's a violin player from the most unlikely place. He's from Minnesota, one of the coldest states in America. Leon Abbey caused a sensation when he first came to Bombay because he led, to use the very racist terminology of the time, the first all-Negro band to play in India. Leon Abbey and his boys landed in a city that was just rising to its feet after the global economic depression that had started with the Wall Street crash of 1929. And as India was beginning to recover in the 30s, this will appeal to the architecture students here, there was a building boom, something that's always good for architecture, for future architects. And Bombay was beginning to build in a style that had come to characterize the jazz age around the world. This is Eros at Churchgate. Many of you all have seen it. Does anybody know what the style is? It's Art Deco. And Bombay developed a great fascination for Art Deco. This is one of my favorite Art Deco buildings. Does anybody know what it is? It's Liberty Cinema. And this is a picture from 1935 of the Symphony Orchestra. Now, all around the colonial world, luxury hotels have served as a place where local elites could be served up a place of culture from the metropolitan centers of the West. So just like Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo and Raffles Hotel in Singapore, the Taj in Bombay prided itself on the place that Bombay high society could get the best, the latest trends from around the world. So its menus had the latest culinary fashions, and it always served up the latest music. This picture is of the Taj Mahal Symphony Orchestra, which they had founded in 1905. And I am fascinated by this picture because it's the orchestra is conducted by a Swiss-Austrian guy. But sitting in the first row looking at us is a chap called Meli Mehta, whose son Zubin Mehta would grow up to become one of the most famous classical musicians in the world. I imagine many of you all have heard of him, if not actually seen him. So it's clear that by 1935, when Leon Abbey came to town, Bombay was familiar with Western music, could be served up a place of culture from the metropolitan centers of the West. So just like Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo and Raffles Hotel in Singapore, the Taj in Bombay prided itself on the place that Bombay high society could get the best, the latest trends from around the world. So its menus had the latest culinary fashions, and it always served up the latest music. This picture is of the Taj Mahal Symphony Orchestra, which they had founded in 1905. And I am fascinated by this picture because it's the orchestra is conducted by a Swiss-Austrian guy. But sitting in the first row looking at us is a chap called Meli Mehta, whose son Zubin Mehta would grow up to become one of the most famous classical musicians in the world. I imagine many of you all have heard of him, if not actually seen him. So it's clear that by 1935, when Leon Abbey came to town, Bombay was familiar with Western music of all kinds, and as hot music, as jazz was being called at that time, became a global craze, it was only natural that it would find its way to Bombay pretty soon. There are no recordings of Leon Abbey in Bombay, but we know from newspaper accounts that he played a solid mixture of swing of the latest jazz music of the time, and also of rumbas and other sort of forms from Latin America, because he had toured South America before coming to Bombay. Though Bombay's upper classes welcomed the chance to dance to this music that was capturing the imagination of their counterparts from around the world, some of them claimed that the change was a little too quick. And this is what the Times of India had to say. His style was so new when Leon first played for us that many of the diehards insisted on simpler tunes and popular numbers. And Leon Abbey's band was forced to make some adjustments. And the Times of India said, their quick steps have slowed from Paris speed, the fastest in all the dancing world, to Bombay speed. But the Times of India sort of seemed to approve of what Leon Abbey was bringing to Bombay. And it said that they have toned down their hotting to meet the less sophisticated tastes of Bombay. Leon Abbey was quite amused by this controversy. I actually met an old musician who had played with him, and he told me that Leon Abbey said, first they swore at my music, then they swore by my music. But Leon Abbey's visit opened the floodgates. His band left at the end of the 1935 season. They played these 6-month seasons, and the band refused to stay because, like so many foreigners, they found the heat difficult to take. But many other bands followed. Leon Abbey was replaced by this guy. His name was Cricket Smith, and he was a trumpet player. And Cricket Smith's most famous sideman was this chap who became a real legend. His name was Teddy Weatherford. And Teddy Weatherford stayed in India for the rest of his life. He married a woman from Calcutta and then died of cholera in the Grand Hotel. And these guys were not only playing the tunes they knew from America, they also began to compose local tunes. And I'm going to play one of those tunes. It sounds very strange and dated. It was made in 1937 by this group of chaps. You can see that they're still on stage at the Taj. There's that wonderful Art Deco backdrop. And listen to the words carefully. And you're probably going to have to help me because I don't seem to be able to get this thing to work. No.
In the shadows of the golden moon, there a tropic breeze softly sighs as you hear the lovers croon. Taj Mahal, Taj Mahal, India's mystic shrine. Taj Mahal, Taj Mahal, film of love divine. In all your grandeur there you stand alone, guarding a secret of your own. Oh Taj Mahal, you fill us with amazement, we all gaze with wonder on you.
So that was called the Taj. The Indians had already been playing jazz by the time these guys came to town. There was this chap, for instance, his name was Ken Mack. He was an Anglo-Indian band leader. But people like him had learned to play this music by listening to records or by reading the music of scores. And having these African-American bands in town was like having a master class. Suddenly you could learn how to play the music from these guys who had learnt it at the source. And people like Cricket Smith played a very important role in introducing a jazz culture to India. They began to hire local musicians and taught them how to play jazz the American way. Among the first people they employed was this chap. His name was Josik Minzi. There was also this character. His name, he shared a surname with me. He was born Fernandes, but he changed his name to Frank Fernand because Fernand probably had a sort of a zing to it. And there was this chap who died only 2 or 3 years ago. His name was Mickey Corea. And pretty soon, Indians became quite proficient at playing jazz. So this is a picture of one of the mixed racial bands at the Taj. You can see Teddy Weatherford at the piano, and you can see Mickey Corea in the corner. And pretty soon, Mickey Corea was leading his own band at the Taj. I really love this picture. And Mickey Corea would stay at the Taj for more than 30 years. He retired only in 1963 when he got diphtheria and he couldn't blow his horn anymore. And soon there was a vibrant dancing culture that sustained the bands. I always I'm always amused by how those women in saris seem to manage to foxtrot without tripping. I later found from this period this list of bands, of jazz bands in Bombay. And it always interests me because it starts from A to Z. There are more than 60 bands. It starts with the Alexandra Band and goes on to the Zoroastrian Symphonians. So it's clear that there were all sorts of people who were playing this music. But it wasn't all fun and games if you were a jazz musician in Bombay around the time of independence. Because partition happened and suddenly Bombay was flooded with a whole bunch of musicians who had until then made their living playing in the parts of the Punjab that had suddenly become Pakistan. And they all flooded to Bombay, and then there was a lot of competition for jobs. But also prohibition had been introduced. It was a great Gandhian ideal. Bombay was among the first places to introduce prohibition, and so hotels were losing money and they weren't hiring as many bands as before. But mainly these jazz musicians were uncertain about what the new India held for them, because there was a suspicion of forms that were considered to be colonial, and jazz was definitely among those kinds of forms. That is when the movies came to the rescue. Quite by coincidence, technological developments in this period allowed sound recording in the films to become much more sophisticated. Until 1931, Indian films had been silent, as you know. And after 1931, Ala Mara happened. And in the early years of the talkies, as those early sound films were called, music was recorded only by small numbers of musicians, pretty much like these guys. There was a single mic and they all had to crowd around the mic. And so the guy at the back, we need another power source. The guy at the back had to sort of play louder, and it was all a very difficult thing to do. But when sound became more, and this kind of music then actually sounded very thin, and it's not very effective screen music. But to effectively convey the drama on stage, to emphasize the urgency of a car chase or to serenade a romance, you need a large orchestra that's all playing together. Now, here there was a problem, because how many of you all have studied, taken music lessons? Well, quite a number of people. So you will know that Indian music, both Hindustani and Carnatic music, is melodic. That means that there's one instrument, the sitar or the flute, and everybody else sort of reiterates that line. And so it doesn't sound very, very full. And for film music to sound impressive, you need lots of people playing together. You need trumpets and violins and all of these. And this is because Western music is harmonic. That means that all of these instruments play music of related pitches, and that gives it its fullness. Very thin, and it's not very effective. When you play a guitar or when you play the chords of a piano, effectively, these are no the drama on stage to emphasize the urgency of a car chase or to serenade a romance. You need a large orchestra that's all playing together. Now, here there was a problem, because how many of you all have studied, taken music lessons? Well, quite a number of people. So you will know that Indian music, both Hindustani and Carnatic music, is melodic. That means that there's one instrument, the sitar or the flute, and everybody else sort of reiterates that line. And so it doesn't sound very full. And for film music to sound impressive, you need lots of people playing together. You need trumpets and violins and all of these. And this is because Western music is harmonic. That means that all of these instruments play music of related pitches, and that gives it its fullness. When you play a guitar or when you play the chords of a piano, you know, these are notes of related pitches. This is harmonic. And that's why Western music sounds fundamentally different from Indian music. Now, this is again what caused a problem, because the guys who were composing Hindi film music, in India we call them music directors, they were mainly trained in the Hindustani classical tradition. So they knew how to write these lovely melodies, but they didn't know how to score them for an orchestra. This is where the jazz musicians came in. What happened was many of these jazz musicians, those guys we saw, Chick Chocolate and all of them, they were Goan, and many of them had studied in Goa. You know, Goa was ruled by the Portuguese all the way up to 1961. And the Portuguese didn't do very much for Goa. They didn't set up industries, which is why so many Goans had to flood to Bombay like my ancestors. But what the Portuguese did do was they set up these schools, these basic schools, where people learned to read and to write and how to play a musical instrument, because you needed to play a musical instrument to perform in the choir in church. And so these Goans knew about how to read and to write music. And the Hindustani composers began to hire these Goans as assistants to help them score for the orchestra. And so this is how it proceeded. They would, the producer of the film would organize what the Goans with their bad Hindi would call, he would organize a baitak, but the Goans with their bad Hindi would call this a sitting. And this is what it looked like. And the director would begin to narrate the plot. And he would say, you know, now we will have a murder scene. And then the music director would say, murder scene, okay, this is what I think the music would sound like. And he would either pick it out in his harmonium or he would sing it. Da-da-da-da-da. Or for a movie it's really tan-tan. And it was the Goan's business to then note it down, to take it down. And then he would go back to the studio, and then he would construct these fragments. He would turn them into an entire tune. And it was not, he was sort of, this would make him sound like a secretary, but he was doing more than that. So once he had got the main tune from the music director, he would also craft the bridges between the verse and the chorus. And because these guys had a really diverse background, they would throw in bits of Bach and classical music, Western classical music. They would throw in Konkani folk tunes. They would throw in a little bit of Portuguese music they knew, and they would throw in jazz tunes. But in addition to the Goans being employed as secretaries, as assistant music directors to score the music, Goans were also the bulk of these large Hindi film orchestras. That's because nobody else knew how to play trumpets and violins and all of these things. And so while the lead instrument was often a sitar or a flute, the background was composed almost entirely of Goans and Anglo-Indians. And pretty soon, the orchestras that you saw in the Hindi films, like this one with C. Ramchandra at the mic, were looking pretty much like those pictures I showed you of the orchestras at the Taj. And more than that, they were beginning to sound pretty much like the orchestras at the Taj. And I'm going to give you a sort of an example of this. Sir, you will have to help me again. This is a film that most of you all probably have not seen. It is called Tarzan Goes to Delhi, and it features Dara Singh as Tarzan. It also has Bhagwan. But if you listen to it, you can hear a jazz trumpet. Sorry, so that is where Dara Singh ended his pixelated journey to Connaught Place. But this is where you often hear the sound of New Orleans in Hindi films in the background as things are moving around. Among the first Goan and jazz musicians to get to the Hindi film studios to work as an arranger, as an assistant music director, was this guy. We saw him earlier, Frank Fernandes. There's this guy. All of you all know his name, I think, but you don't recognize him. So when the film Amar Akbar Anthony was being made, the music was being composed by Pyare Lal, and he decided to name one of the characters after this guy, who was a famous arranger in the Hindi films, but he was also Pyare Lal's violin teacher. And this guy is the real Anthony Gonsalves, which is how Amitabh Bachchan came to jump out of a giant Easter egg saying, "My name is Anthony Gonsalves." Chick Chocolate, as we know, was already in the Hindi film studios. Can you recognize the people here? There's a very young Lata Mangeshkar, and then there's Mohammad Rafi and C. Ramchandra in the background. I'm going to leave you now with a fragment of this sound. I'm really fascinated by this period of film history, because to begin with, this was world music that was being created in the film studios every day, long before the term world music had actually been invented. But in addition, this music echoed the dreams of newly independent India. Everyday composers who were mainly Hindu and lyricists who were mainly Urdu-speaking Muslims and Goan Catholic musicians were sitting in the Hindi film studios every day, demonstrating through music that it was actually possible to find a way to bridge our differences. And I'm going to play a small fragment of that sound now. You're going to have to help me do it. This is a song you've probably all heard. It's Gore Gore from Samadhi in 1950. But perhaps the next time you listen to it, listen more carefully to the chocolate solo.
गोरी गोरी ओ बाकी छोरी चाहे रोज बुलाया करो गोरे गोरे ओ बाकी छोरे कभी मेरी गली आया करो गोरी गोरी ओ बाकी छोरी चाहे रोज बुलाया करो
Thank you.
Naresh, just hold on with the mic. There may be some questions for you.
Hi Naresh, I'm Sabira Fernandes.
Oh, hi.
I wanted to know what
You haven't
got
changed
you.
your name to Fernand.
No, no. But yeah, I knew Mickey Uncle, Mickey Correa, and they were my dad's contemporaries.
Okay, was your father in the films too?
No, he wasn't in the films, but my grand uncle was in the films.
Oh, what is his name?
Um,
Oh, that's okay.
he was a. I keep forgetting it. Anyway, what got you into writing and researching about the music, the influence of Goan and Latin music in Hindi films?
You know, I began to realize as I was listening to this music that it was really such a melange of different things. And I became quite curious about how all of these sounds came to the Hindi films. But okay, I'll give you the real answer. It's because I was interested in a piece of gossip. So a few years ago, I began to research a piece about Konkani pop music. I'm not sure how many of you all have heard this. Konkani pop music sort of really emerged in Goa in the 1960s. And it's a big sort of rock and roll sound with a lot of funk in it. And I was surprised by how contemporary this stuff actually sounded. So I decided to go and try to figure out how it happened. And I began to sort of try to meet some of the musicians who had done this. And they told me this astonishing story of the two people who were mainly at the forefront who had made this. There was a guy called Chris Perry, who was a trumpet player. He was actually born Pereira, but like everybody else, he changed his name to Perry. And the woman who sang these songs, her name was Lorna. And Chris Perry and Lorna had a rip-roaring affair, which completely shocked the sort of Catholic sensibilities in Goa and in Bombay. So I actually began to chase this piece of gossip to try to figure out how the affair between Chris Perry and Lorna unfolded. And as I talked to these people about Chris Perry and Lorna, but also about how the Konkani music was made in the 60s, they would tell me these stories about these African Americans who had come here in the 30s and who they had learned their craft from. And I didn't pay it much attention. And then once the internet was invented, I began to Google these guys. And I realized that some of those musicians, Leon Abbey, Teddy Weatherford, they'd actually been quite significant in America. And they had left in the 1930s to come to Asia to escape racism at home. And in India and in Asia, they were revered. And so I was quite interested in tracing that journey. And then when I realized that jazz had come to influence, Hindi film music, which is India's most popular music, I was completely fascinated. And then there was a third bit to this story, because in the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, when Russia was fighting America, they were doing everything to try to win the hearts and minds of people in Asia and Africa to bring them to their side. And they were sending us all sorts of cultural things. So the Russians would send us cheap books and translations of children's literature, and the Kirov ballet, and also some terrible pop music. I don't know how you guys remember it, but I was traumatized in my teenage years by a large Russian woman called Alla Pugacheva. But anyway, so that didn't make me very sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And the Americans were sending us all this stuff. They would send Neil Armstrong to tour India, and they would send jazz bands. And I began to sort of try to figure out how music was used as a weapon. And that got really interesting, because it turned out that the CIA was actually organizing some of these jazz tours that brought some of the most famous jazz musicians to India, Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. And I realized that sort of this seemingly marginal music actually had many rich stories associated with it. And it was a way of telling a sort of history of a certain sort of India from the 30s to the 60s. So that is the very long answer. It started with a piece of gossip.
Yeah, there's another question up there.
Hi, I'm Pratyancha. I wanted to ask you, I personally feel that jazz as a genre, it's really underrated in India. See, for me, jazz for the longest time has been this music you hear in elevators and lobbies, and this music that's played in, desi daily soaps when couples are having, these romantic time together. And then, of course, Ornette Coleman and Dave Brubeck happened, and I got to know a lot about jazz. Like, I'm really not into jazz much, but right now, so much of jazz music has been used in Bollywood, and I was hardly aware of it. So why do you think that jazz as a music form or as a genre is not as popular in India?
Actually, jazz is not popular anywhere in the world. So, so let me explain this. All music and all culture goes through phases. And between the 30s and the 60s, jazz was the world's pop. It was the most popular form, and everybody from Argentina to Australia was listening to this stuff and trying to make something of it that was their own. Then rock and roll happened, and then the world began to listen to rock and roll. And now jazz is a marginal form everywhere, and jazz is a marginal form in India too. It actually shows that we keep moving with the times. So like I said, in the 1860s, Bombay was listening to the great new thing, which at that time was Italian opera. And then when jazz became the next new thing, that's what they began to listen to. and now we listen to rap and heavy metal and God knows what else you young people do. But it means that we're moving, we're not static, we're always looking for something. But what I find fascinating about the way this works in India is that we take the next new thing and we find a way to make it our own. So we have, things like the Raghu Dikshit band, and before them Indian Ocean. And in architecture the same thing was happening. In architecture I'm not so certain whether we're finding new ways to express an Indianness. It definitely happened with Art Deco, it's not happening with Hafiz Contractor. Or maybe it is, and that's then a really scary expression of Indianness.
I hope we don't have Hafiz in the audience. Yeah, I know there are Hafiz Contractor employees here, but...
Don't report me to your boss. All right, thanks. You guys have been a great audience.